Sometimes life can be immensely beautiful and joyful, right? When we're surrounded by the beauty of nature and just in awe of what, God has created there. When we're surrounded by people who love us deeply and they care for us. When we're celebrating the wins and the successes of life. These are joyful things. These are beautiful things and beautiful parts of life. Other times, life can be immensely difficult and painful, right? We see pain and suffering all around us in the world. We see, when we hear of children who die every day because they lack enough food or basic medical care. We see pictures and videos of tsunamis wiping away entire villages and towns, carrying away hundreds, thousands of lives with the waters. Our world is struggling right now to respond to a huge humanitarian need of the refugee crisis. Millions of people fleeing war-torn countries, just trying to find a place where they can survive. So we see it in the world around us, but it's also so close to home, right? We know, each of us personally knows the reality of pain and suffering in this life. Right here, just in our church, in this small community, most of us have experienced the death of a loved one. We know what that feels like for someone to pass away. Some are experiencing debilitating life-changing medical conditions. Others have experienced or are experiencing trauma from their experiences in battle as they've served our country. Some are carrying the wounds of past abuse in their lives, things that were perpetrated against them. Some know the pain of a marriage ending or going through that ending even right now. And I could go on and on with example after example because we know the realities of pain and suffering. We all encounter it in various forms and from different sources. And sometimes it seems as if the scale in life is tipped. And there's more pain and suffering than there is joy and beauty at times. And when it feels out of balance that way, we begin to ask questions, critical questions like, where is God in all of this? In fact, can there even be a God in light of the pain and suffering that I'm experiencing, that I see in this world around us? And the questioning rolls, and it goes like this, that, well, God is supposedly all-powerful and all-knowing and loving, right? That's who you tell me God is. A God like that would not allow people to suffer. And since we do suffer, we obviously do, then God must not be powerful and knowing and loving, or maybe he doesn't exist at all. All right, and so you can see how these thoughts and this logic develops. I recently read an article where the author was soliciting responses from his audience. And he said, tell me why you stopped believing in God. And as I read through the published answers, right, and was kind of adding up and categorizing them, about 40% of the answers were related to suffering of some kind or another. Sufferings that person had experienced or they had witnessed in the life of a loved one. And they said, because of these things, I can't believe in God anymore. And so this problem deserves our attention. In the video, it said, if you could ask God one question, the number one response is, why is there pain and suffering in this world? It deserves our consideration and our thought, because even if it is not a deal for you, if it's a non-issue for you, it is a deal, it is an issue for a lot of people. And they deserve for us to take time to have an answer. And there are answers to these questions about pain and suffering and God and how those two relate. And there's an answer for our heart and an answer for our minds of how we think about these things. And we do have answers. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, we can do much more than kind of shrug and mumble and hope they don't ask us to repeat it because we don't know what to say. There are answers, and we have good, logical reasons for believing in the good, powerful, loving God of the Bible, despite all of the suffering and the pain that we experience in this life. Answers for both the heart and the mind. how we think about it, and how we experience it, and how others experience it. And I believe that believing in the God of the Bible, in the midst of all of this pain and suffering, provides the best answers for our hearts and for our minds as we wrestle through this. Today we're going to start with kind of the logic and reason side of it, right? The how and the why. How can God be real? Why do we suffer? And then we're going to work our way to the heart of how do I live through this? Where is there help? Where is there hope for me or for my friend, for my loved one in the midst of the pain and suffering? And so if you're in that place of pain and suffering yourself, I get that you may not want to hear a lot of logic and reason, that you're hurting. You just want to hear, make me feel better. All right, so hang with me, and we got to lay the foundation of that logic and reason so that we can then speak to the heart. All right? And this morning, we are going to start with the logic and reason. And the first part of it deals with God's existence. You know, when I was going through that, the progression there about, well, if God is real and we suffer, so God maybe isn't real or maybe he's not good and this and that. One of the conclusions is that because we suffer, God must not be real. Maybe there's not a God at all because we suffer. And while I can relate to that sentiment, while I can relate to that emotion and that feeling, that sense of God's absence because I'm hurting, because I'm suffering, the logic of it just doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up. When we're hurting and suffering, it feels as if God may not be there, if he's not real. But in actuality, the fact that we call anything suffering, we can only do that if God is real. Something can only be considered suffering if God does in fact exist. All right? And this is so critical and so pivotal here. Peter Kraft, who's a professor of philosophy at Boston College, he does a much better job of explaining. He's a little bit smarter than I am. And he has infographics in his video as well, which are always fun. And so I want us to watch this little video of Professor Kraft explaining, why does suffering show us that God is in fact real?
In addition, if there were no God, there would be no absolute standard of good. Every judgment presupposes a standard. And that's true of our moral judgments too. What is our standard for judging evil to be evil? The most we could say about evil, if there were no God, was that we, in our subjective tastes, didn't like it when people did certain things to other people. We wouldn't have a basis for saying an act was bad, only that we didn't like it. So the problem of human evil exists only if God exists. As for natural suffering, that poses what appears to be a more difficult question. We see an innocent child suffer, say, from an incurable disease. We complain. Understandable. We don't like it. Understandable. We feel it is wrong, unfair, and shouldn't happen. Understandable. But illogical unless you believe in God. For if you do not believe in God, your subjective feelings are the only basis upon which you can object to natural suffering. Okay, you don't like it, but how is your not liking something evidence for God not existing? Think about it. It's just the opposite. Our judgments of good and evil, natural as well as human, presuppose God as the standard. If there's no God, there's neither good nor evil. There's just nature, doing what it does. If nature is all there is absolutely no need to explain why one person suffers and another doesn't. Unjust suffering is a problem only because we have a sense of what is just and unjust. But where does this sense come from? Certainly not from nature. There's nothing just about nature. Nature is only about survival. What, in other words, does it mean for suffering to be unnecessary or wrong? How is that determined? Against what standard? Your private standard means nothing. My private standard means nothing. We can talk meaningfully about suffering being unnecessary or wrong only if we have an underlying belief that a standard of right and wrong objectively exists. And if that standard really exists, that means there is a God.
Pain and suffering gives us this feeling that maybe God is not there, that he's absent because we're hurting. It's like the woman in the opening video who talked about her grandmother dying of cancer and saying, God cannot be real, because no God would ever inflict this kind of pain, right? And I can empathize with someone feeling that way. I can empathize with saying that in the midst of that pain and suffering. But the fact that we have that sense that this is wrong, this should not be happening, points to the very existence of God in the first place. It doesn't point away from him, it points to him. That his existence gives us that sense that suffering is unjust, because God never intended for our world to have pain and suffering in it. Pain and suffering was not the intent or the design in God's creation, and so our dislike for it, our sense that it should not happen, comes from our longing to have what God intended for us to have. A world without brokenness, a world without pain, and a world without suffering. So suffering gives us that feeling that I don't know if God's even there. But that very sense is what points us to God. What about the other conclusion? Okay, you're saying God is real. I get, I could maybe follow that. But if he's real and suffering is real, then God must not be very good or powerful or loving. Because either he caused the evil and the suffering because he's not very good, or he allows it to continue and to perpetuate because he's not powerful enough or loving enough to do anything about it. And again, in the realm of how we think in our minds and our logic about this, it doesn't hold up when we examine it. You see, one flaw in this conclusion is the target of blame, that God is the one to blame for our cause, when in fact, God is not the cause of our suffering. You see, God is not abusing children. People are doing that. God is not taking a person's life. God is not fighting the wars that are resulting in the deaths of so many and causing the millions of refugees. People are doing those things. God did not make the marriage dissolve. People's actions did that. The only thing we could accurately say God did in all of these things is that he made the people that did these things. And so some have reached the conclusion, well, if God made the people that did all of these things, that caused all the suffering, then that is how God is guilty. That is why we can blame God. It's like the lady in the opening video, he said, that why would anyone, she didn't even want to say God's name, why would anyone make people who do such terrible things to each other? It doesn't make any sense. One person submitted a question to us, and it said, if God knew Adam and Eve were going to eat of, the forbidden fruit, why did he put it in the garden in the first place? It would have been so much easier if he had just left that tree out, right? Therefore, God is to blame. It's God's fault that everything is the way it is. And I get it. I kind of get the sentiment. I've wondered that myself from time to time. But it misses the point of what God was wanting to create in humanity, what he wanted to create in us. You see, he wanted to create beings that could choose, that could be, that were capable of right and beauty and goodness and relationship. And to do that, he had to make us free. We had to be significantly free in order to be good and right and capable of these things. And to be significantly free, we had to have the ability to choose between moral good and moral evil. There had to be this ability to choose between moral good and moral evil. You see, only when we have the ability to choose evil can good exist. Only when we have the ability to choose hate can love exist. Only when we have the ability to reject can relationships truly exist. Because if you take away our ability to choose, then we're nothing more than robots. We're pre-programmed to do this and this and this, and that cannot be love. That cannot be forgiveness. That cannot be goodness or beauty, because we're just doing what we're pre-programmed to do. So to be people who could actually be capable of good, we had to have the ability to reject good. To be capable of love, we had to have the ability to hate. And all of these things. And so while it would be simpler if God had just removed that option, right? Just remove the ability to choose wrong and evil over good. That would have been easier and simpler. We would not be able to choose and to truly love him or one another. And so God gave us this, our freedom. And so therefore we are one source of the evil and suffering in this world when we abuse our freedom to choose between right and wrong. Another source that Professor Kreff mentioned was natural suffering, right? It's not people doing things per se, but it's more of the natural order of things where the course of nature, earthquakes, floods, famines, all that kind of stuff. We have no ability to stop these things. We don't instigate them, in the particular instances, right? We're not causing hurricanes. For many, these natural sufferings present the harder question. And it leaves us asking, why would God let that happen? And to be perfectly honest, in my reading and my thinking, I do not have a good answer for that. I have not found an answer that satisfies my heart and my mind on why God allows these things to happen. But he does. People do die from hurricanes and famine and illnesses and all of these things. He allows them to persist in our world. But does that mean that he's not loving, that he's not powerful, that he's not caring? And I think we have to look beyond just the why would God let this happen? And we have to ask the how and the who. How does God respond? Who helps us? Because we're stuck with suffering. That's not going to change today or tomorrow. We are stuck with the reality of suffering in this world and in our lives. Who can help us with that? Who can bring hope and help to that? How does anyone help us in our pain and suffering? What belief system helps the most? And just to line them up, and I want to just take a few minutes this morning and to see where can we find help and hope in light of the suffering that we experience, because asking why alone doesn't really do anything for us. Who can help us? Is it Buddhism? Buddhism is one of the major world belief systems. About 8% of the world follows Buddhism. How do Buddhists respond to suffering and to pain? Well, the first two noble truths of Buddhism say this. One, that all of life is suffering. All right? You're going to suffer. Two, you suffer because of your attachments to the things of this world. You suffer because of your attachments to things in this life. Can we get that one up there, please? And if you would just realize that you're suffering in this life because you're too attached to the things in this world, then you wouldn't suffer as much. Basically, if you just cared less about the people and the things going on around you, you wouldn't suffer as much. Because this world, this life doesn't matter. And beyond that, the system of karma says that if you suffer now, and if you learn from your suffering now to care less about this world, to let go, then you may not suffer as much in your next life when you're reborn. You might be a little bit better off. And so enjoy your suffering now. Maybe you'll learn a lesson. That's Buddhism. Hinduism is about 15% of the world practices Hinduism, almost completely in India. And it shares some similarities with Buddhism. Hinduism, major tenets are both karma and reincarnation. Hinduism essentially says that if you are suffering, it's because you did something bad in your past life. And you deserve whatever it is you've got right now. And if you suffer, then you're paying for what you did. And in the next life, you'll be better off. Right? You don't have to pay for it. So if you see someone suffering, you do not want to help them. Because if you do, you're going to short circuit the karmic cycle, and they're just going to get stuck with more suffering the next time they're reborn. So just let them be, let them suffer. Maybe they'll get a better deal next time. One of the major society structures of Hinduism is the caste system. And people are born into their caste, their level of society based on karma. And if you did right in your past life, or if you suffered and learned from it, then you'll be born into a better life here. And so the higher the caste, the better life. The wealthier you are, the nicer things you have, the easier life is. The bottom level is terrible. I've walked those streets. I've been there as we've walked alongside our mission partner, Bombay Teen Challenge. I've seen the people living in that lowest caste, and their life is terrible. But they deserve it because they did something. They did something. We don't know what it is, but they did something that deserves being there. And we're not going to help them because if we do, they're just going to show up here in the next life. And so we've got to let them suffer. Right? In both Buddhism and Hinduism, their whole structure for understanding suffering boils down to you deserve it. You did something to deserve it. I don't know what it is, but if you suffer enough, if you learn from it, maybe you'll have better in the next life when you're reborn. That's not a lot of help and hope for me. What about Islam? Islam is the world's second largest religion. It is about, 24% of the world. And I understand that I'm simplifying some things here, all right? But in Islam, pain and suffering are seen as instruments to help you learn to submit to Allah. And that as you suffer, if you will learn to pray the right way and often enough and to do the right things, to obey the right rules that Allah has given you, if you learn to obey and submit, then He will not have to make you suffer as much, because you're learning your lesson. All right? So it's an instrument to teach you to learn. We don't help people who are suffering because they need to learn their lesson and submit to the will of Allah. What about secularism? This is the world's third largest belief system, about 16% of the world. And this is really kind of a combination, a grouping of different belief systems that exclude God. There is no God in atheism, agnosticism. In deism, He's there, but He's not doing anything, so he's just kind of removed. And to me, these systems pose the biggest problem and the least help to anyone. Because, like Professor Kreff said in his video, if you remove God from the equation, there is no basis for saying that this should or that shouldn't happen. Right? There is no basis. There's no reason other than our personal and private dislike for something. I didn't like when that tornado hit my family and destroyed everything. But guess what? Nature does not care if you like the tornado or not. Just deal with it if there is no God. And beyond that, there's no one to ever fix anything. Without God, if you take God out of the equation, there is no hope of wrongs ever being made right again. If someone does evil against you and they make you suffer and they get away with it, guess what? They're always going to get away with it. No one will ever be able to intervene and make that wrong right. They will never face punishment or judgment if there is no God. The hurts that we carry around, if there is no God, there is no one to heal that hurt. We're suffering because of something that happened, or we lost a loved one, or whatever. You know what? Without God, that's just the course of nature. Quit complaining about it and move on, because that's just the way it is. Without God, there is no framework, and there is no help and hope to any of the pain and suffering in this life. That is just a desolate option. And this brings us to Christianity, which is technically the world's largest religion. About a third of the world would believe in the Bible and Jesus in some degree or another. And this is the God that often gets the blame. People are blaming the God of the Bible when they say that God did this or God did that. But what do we find? What do we find in the Bible that helps us understand our suffering? And then what do we see about God's response to our suffering? We've already talked about the framework, understanding our suffering, and it all comes back to us, that we are the cause, right? When we choose moral evil over good, then we are causing suffering. Think about the natural world, natural disasters. If you trace it all the way back to the beginning, the Bible tells us that even those are our fault. That first rejection of good and right and God has set in course a cycle of brokenness that has affected even the natural world, resulting in famines and disasters and illnesses, all of the things that God never put into creation, but we entered when we broke it all. So in effect, we are the problem. All right? So we understand it. That's still not, there's not a whole lot of hope in that, right? Because it's our fault. But how does God respond? Is He like Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam, where it's like, listen, you broke it, you deal with it. It's your fault. It's your problem. Don't expect me to come in and solve this broken world just because you don't like what you've ended up with. Is that how God responds? No. That is not what we discover when we read the Bible and we see how does God respond to us. First of all, we see that in fact God will change things. That this current reality will not always be our experience. And we have hope that he will respond to all of this. Look in Revelation chapter 21 with me. And we're given a vision of someday. Someday, this is what will happen. Verse 3, I heard a loud voice from the throne, God's throne, saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. We live in the old order right now that is filled with pain and death and mourning and crying, but that will not always be the reality. One day, God will make all things right again, and everything will be beautiful. Everything will be lovely. There will be no more death, no more crying, no more pain. And all of God's people, those who have trusted in Jesus, will live in this suffering-free place forever. That's a beautiful hope for the future. But waiting for that day doesn't help a whole lot today. You know, it kind of gives us in the back of our head, it's like, all right, it's not always going to be this bad. But when is that day going to be here? Amazingly, the God who will eliminate our suffering at one day has also entered into our suffering here and now. He's not only going to make all things right one day, but he's entered into our suffering now to walk alongside us. In the person of Jesus, God took on human flesh and form, and he lived a human life, including all of the suffering that we know and that we experience. Hebrews 2, starting in verse 10, tells us this, that in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, that's us, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation, that's Jesus, perfect through what he suffered. Not through an easy life, but through what he suffered. And skipping to verse 17. For this reason, he, that's Jesus, had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Jesus could have lived his life of privilege and honor. That yes, God became man, but it was a privileged life. You know, he could have been the one guy that never got rained on because the rain just, never hit him. But that is not the life that Jesus lived. He entered into the full human experience with all of the mess, all of the pain, all of the suffering. He knows the suffering that we know. And it says that he became a merciful and faithful high priest for us. That he himself suffered so that he is able to now help us because he can relate to us. How does he do this? 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves received from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. See, God is a God of comfort and compassion. And he meets us in those moments when we're hurting, when we're suffering, when we're experiencing something that he never intended for us to go through. He's right there with us. He walks alongside us with comfort and compassion. Even if that suffering never ends in this life, even if you never recover from that condition, even if that hurt never fully heals, God walks with us every step of the way. And he empowers his people followers of Jesus, to come alongside those who are suffering. That's why Christianity has such a rich and long history of running towards suffering. That when there's people hurting, when there's unjust suffering, we run to it. We don't say, well, I don't know what you did, but you deserve that, so too bad. No, we run because we want to bring, not because we're great, but because the God of comfort and compassion is creating that in us and compelling us to enter into the suffering of others. How sad, I think, for people like this guy from the opening video. And he said, I don't think God is like a being that you pray to and then he's going to help you. I think he's just there, I guess. Right? How sad is that? To never know the comfort and compassion of the God of the universe. To never have that presence with you. To think that God is there, he's just not there for me. He doesn't care for me. I'm not on his radar. How sad. Pain and suffering are an inescapable part of the human experience, whether it comes from natural sources or whether it's perpetrated by a person choosing evil over good. We experience pain and suffering on an ongoing basis. And it does stir questions of why. Why did this happen? And why did God let that happen? But I still think the bigger question is who? Who can help me? Because I'm suffering, and I want to know who can help me. And hands down, the answer to that question is clear. It's only the God of the Bible. It's only Jesus. If we're suffering and we turn from him and we say, I can't believe in this God, who do we turn to? What other option is even there? There is no option that brings the help and the hope and the understanding that the God of the Bible, that Jesus brings into our hearts and into our lives in the midst of our suffering. So if you are one who has turned away from God because of your suffering or the suffering of others, maybe you've witnessed terrible things and you've turned from God because of that, I hope you're hearing a reason to reconsider that, and a reason to turn back to him or to turn to him for the first time. If you're in the midst of that pain and suffering right now, know that the God of comfort and the God of compassion desires to be in your life and to be there and to give you that compassion and comfort from him. And as you place your faith and trust in Jesus, all of that becomes available, his full presence with you. If you're here and you're like, I'm not suffering right now. I have in the past, I probably will tomorrow, but I'm not right now. Well, then understand that you have been given a mission, a calling by God to enter into the suffering of others just like he has entered into your suffering, and to be one who brings compassion and comfort to others in whatever way you can. That when we see suffering, we are not allowed to say, not my problem, or I wonder what they did to deserve that. Our calling is to enter into it and to help, to bring God's grace and compassion to that person so that they may see his love and grace and they can have the chance to respond to him as well. If you're here this morning and you're carrying some degree of pain and suffering, and you're like, I want to talk to someone about this. I want someone to pray for me. I just want someone to listen to me. Know that our prayer team will be available following the service. We just invite you to linger for a few moments. Unburden yourself to them and let them pray over you, and invite the God of comfort and compassion to be near to you. Let's pray. Father, we lift our voices to you and we just say thank you, because we all experience suffering in this life and we hate it. It is not good. We know that this is not what you intend for us to experience, but it is the reality we live in. And even though it's all of our fault and choosing, God, you don't leave us here. You meet us in our suffering with your compassion and your grace, your comfort. Father, for those who are hurting right now, God, I pray that they would feel your presence, that they would know your comfort and your compassion even right now and moving forward. God, for all of us who are your followers, your people, help us, equip us to enter into the suffering of others. To not say, not my problem, but to enter into it just as you have entered into our suffering and to help them. Amen.
So thank you, Pastor Dave. We're going to worship in a different way here in a moment.